I simulated Trump's policies in Democracy 4, a government simulation game, and this is what happened. Over the last weeks, I have read hundreds of articles about Trump's promises in the campaign and his policies during his 4 years in government. I took notes and I matched his positions with policies available in Democracy 4. Trump supports record funding for the police. I go to the simulation and massively increase funding for the police. Trump wants to reduce the corporate tax. I reduce the corporate tax. Trump likes nuclear energy. I allow widespread expansion of nuclear energy. Overall, I mapped 100 policies that Trump supports in 7 different areas and I fitted it into the simulation. And this will be interesting because we will be able to see the specific impacts of these policies on several issues: crime, violent crime, drug cartels, poverty, drug abuse, equality, GDP, debt, education, health, foreign relations, global influence, and many, many more. So are you ready? Let's see what happened. So first of all, let's see what has been the impact of Trump's policies and proposals on crime and law and order. I'm speaking about this first because this is obviously the main focus of Trump in his campaign. He has promised that he will reduce crime, violent crime, drug cartels, and similar things. So let's see what has been the impact of the different policies that he has promised. So first of all, let's have a look at what happened overall with crime and violent crime. So let's have a look at non-violent crime first. So the game started here. The crime was extremely elevated, basically to the maximum, and we implemented several policies to reduce this in line with Trump's policies, but the impact was quite small. Non-violent crime decreased by a bit over 10%, which is something, but it's not a huge improvement. And here we can see how we did several things. So in line with Trump's policies, we massively increased funding for the police. Here you can see how basically we quadrupled the amount of funding that the police has. And this had quite a big impact in terms of reducing crime and violent crime, and also other things like alcohol abuse, drug addiction, antisocial behavior. But still, crime overall didn't reduce that much. We introduced other policies, like we made the policing regime very harsh. This means that basically the police can handle difficult situations in a violent way, so using violence to reduce people who are creating that situation or that are doing something illegal. We have also introduced the castle doctrine when it comes to self-defense laws. This basically means that people can use force against people who are committing a crime, even if that means that they end up killing that person. That's what the castle doctrine means, and we changed it. Of course, we also have armed police almost to the maximum. There is no limit to weapons laws. Since crime was not really decreasing that much, we introduced other policies that at some point Trump has spoken about, so stop and frisk zones. This basically means areas in cities where the police can stop and frisk anyone without a reason. So just randomly check people, which can have an impact in reducing crime, but it can increase racial tension because often it ends up being non-white men who are checked by the police, and it can also increase authoritarian powers. So this is the situation with crime. It went down by a bit over 10%, but not that much, despite all the policies that we introduced. And the reason is that while we introduced many policies to reduce crime, many of the social roots of this level of crime, such as emotions of frustration and envy, antisocial behavior, alcohol abuse, drug addiction, unemployment, poverty, etc., were not really solved or improved. So it did have an impact on crime, but not a huge impact. Honestly, I was expecting a bit of a higher impact of the many different policies that we have introduced. Now, let's see what was the impact on violent crime. So these are different crimes such as murder, rape, and muggings. Here we can see how Trump's policies had a way bigger impact than on general crime. Violent crime reduced by over 30%. That's quite a lot. Not as much as I expected, but that's quite a lot. And here we can see how the main reason was the high number of police and armed police that we have. So again, I increased the funding for the police massively in line with Trump's policies. I allowed military equipment for police. By then, since crime was not reducing that much, I allowed military patrols in cities. This is something that Trump has considered in the past, and he might do if the situation with crime doesn't really improve rapidly enough. We also increase the policing regime to make it very harsh, so that police can use violence in a wide range of situations, and this has a positive impact in terms of reducing crime, but it increases police use of force and other issues. Something else that we did to reduce violent crime is making the prison sentencing practice very harsh. This means that prison sentencing is very broad, is used widely, and it focuses on harsh, long sentences instead of focusing on rehabilitation. So Trump's policies have had quite an impact in terms of reducing violent crime. And let's see, for instance, the issue of drug cartels, because this has been one of the main focuses of Trump's during the campaign. At some point, he said that the drug cartels are waging war on America, and it's now time for America to wage war on the cartels. So that's been one of the main priorities of the campaign. And we can see here how the different policies promised by Trump did have a big impact in terms of reducing the influence of drug cartels, but not quite enough. I mean, it really went down a lot, but they were very persistent. And here we can see how we increased massively the prison sentencing practice. We made it very, very harsh in line with Trump's policies. In line with his promises, we allowed military equipment for police. This had a big impact in terms of reducing the influence of drug cartels. We increased the police. We increased the policing regime to make it very harsh. Armed police, stop and frisk zones, military patrols in cities, again, something that he has promised if the situation is not in control. So we can see how this had a big impact, but it proved quite persistent. By then it just reduced very, very slowly. And this has to do, of course, with latent, root social issues. So the social and economic issues that are at the core of the existence of drug cartels. And this has to do with poverty levels, unemployment, illegal narcotics consumption, ghettos, and similar issues. Here we can see how poverty, for instance, went down a bit, but remained very high. Unemployment went up a bit in the beginning and then reduced, but it was very stable, really. So we can see, and this is very interesting, how Trump's policies have had an impact on reducing crime, and especially violent crime, but they haven't really addressed the core issues, the root issues of crime, such as poverty or unemployment, and that's why it has had an impact, but not a huge impact. First of all, we can see here how all these different policies had a huge impact on police brutality, which, to be fair, was already extremely high, but it stayed very high during the whole 4 years of Trump's presidency. This is, of course, related to police use of force, and it makes sense that it remained extremely high because, we gave military equipment to the police, we made the policing regime very, very harsh, we provided a lot of funding to the armed police, and so, of course, police brutality was an issue. Now, to be fair, I left some level of body cameras. So this is cameras that policemen have to wear so that later it's possible to check if they have exceeded themselves in using force against suspects. And this is because Trump, in the past, he has said that some level of body cameras are necessary. He made some statements along those lines. So I left some level of funding for body cameras for policemen, but this didn't really have a big impact. Now, something very interesting too is checking the impact of the harsh approach to prison sentencing in terms of prison capacity, right? Because basically, if you send a lot of people to prison based on the crimes that they have done, that will mean that you either need to build more prisons or you will not have enough space in prisons. And here we can see how it's remained quite stable, so it didn't become a problem despite a lot of people going to prison. And this is mostly related to private prisons. In line with Trump's policies, I have allowed and promoted the existence of private prisons. So this is prisons that are not run by the state, but rather by private companies. This is something that Trump has actually supported quite a lot as a way to have more prison capacity. So during his presidency, he promoted quite a lot. He actually receives quite a lot of funding from companies that provide these services. So we can see how, whatever you think about it, it did have an impact in terms of increasing prison capacity and not having a huge issue of prison overcrowding. Something interesting too is what happened to the recidivism rate. This rate is the amount of former prisoners who end up getting arrested again for criminal actions or gone through a rehabilitation program. So this makes sense because, of course, when you make the policing regime very harsh and the prison regime very harsh, that means that a bigger amount of people who have already gone through prison, they will struggle to reintegrate in society, and they will probably get arrested again in the future. So, unsurprisingly, the recidivism rate has gone up by quite a lot, and prison overcrowding had also quite an influence on that. Now, to be fair, I introduced a prisoner rehabilitation program. The goal of this rehabilitation program is to re-educate those who commit crimes with the end goal of reintegrating them into society. This can involve a plethora of methods ranging from psychological treatment to education programs. And I did this because actually Trump, during his presidency, introduced the First Step Act that was a big policy that had to do with this, with prison rehabilitation programs. And so that actually surprised me quite a lot. I didn't know that he supported this kind of policies. So in line with his positions on the topic, I did introduce this program, and I think it had an impact in terms of not having this recidivism rate extremely high. So it did increase, but it increased less than what I thought. Now let's have a look at what happened with immigration and illegal immigration. This was very, very interesting. So first, let's say immigration. Immigration basically plummeted to the point that there's almost no immigration right now. And this was related to different Trump policies. But first, let me show you as well what happened with illegal immigration specifically. It also plummeted. There's basically no illegal immigration now. Now, this has to do with several policies that Trump has defended that you probably already know about. So Trump wants to finish the wall in the border. So I implemented a border wall that had huge effect. He also wants more immigration enforcement forces. So I increased funding for that. And also I made border controls very, very harsh in line with what he has said. So I basically allowed armed guards to be there at the border to control immigration, which has had a big impact in terms of illegal immigration, but also illegal narcotics. We're going to speak about that in a moment. So both illegal immigration and immigration have gone down by a lot. They basically almost don't exist. Now, another factor that was very, very important in terms of reducing immigration and illegal immigration is the lack of immigration demand. This is related to several issues. But basically, for instance, I introduced a total ban on refugee policy in line with what Trump has promised. I also made the citizenship test very difficult, so less people can reach citizenship. Again, these are all things that Trump has promised that he would do as president, but it also had to do with things that Trump didn't really intend. For instance, there's high unemployment, which reduces immigration demand. There's been very little stability, which also reduces immigration demand. So basically, the combination of harsh policies on the border and harsh policies on immigration, like the border wall, the border controls, the total ban on refugees, etc., and the low immigration demand, which has to do with those policies, but also on economic issues, has led to a total plummeting of immigration, which is very interesting. So overall, in terms of law and order, we can say that Trump's policies were quite effective, even though with some limitations. Here we can see, for instance, the sense of safety. So the subjective sense of safety of people has gone up by a lot. And this has to do with, increasing the police, promoting gated communities, having a harsh prison sentencing practice, allowing military patrols in cities, and also basically having no limits to gun ownership, which has increased by a lot legal gun ownership. So sense of safety has increased by a lot. Violent crime has decreased by quite a lot, but less than I expected, taking into account the different measures that we introduced, like military equipment for police, military patrols in cities, extreme amount of funding for the police. It reduced, but not by that much. And crime, normal crime, non-violent crime, has gone down by around 10%, which is not that much. It's an improvement, but it's not that much. So overall, I think we can say in terms of law and order and crime, Trump's policies have been quite effective, but not that much. I expected it to be more effective. And I think the main reason is that the social determinants of crime, so issues like poverty, unemployment, inequality, substance use and abuse, have not really improved. In some cases, it has getting worse. So that's why crime has gone down, but not by that much. So let's talk about the economy and let's talk about the GDP, because this is really something that I did not expect. For context, the simulation started around here when we started introducing policies, and I really did not expect this. So GDP at the beginning went down, and then it remained persistently low during the whole simulation. I really did not expect this because in line with Trump's promises, I basically cancelled all kinds of pollution controls. If you're interested, there's a very complete, very interesting article on the New York Times about how Trump reduced or cancelled different regulations of the Obama era in everything that has to do with emission controls and emissions regulations and standards. Also in line with what Trump promises in his famous drill baby drill, I offered high oil drilling subsidies to increase the supply of oil, which is supposed to reduce oil prices and improve the GDP, improve the growth of the country. So I offered very high oil drilling subsidies, and still, while it's supposed to improve the situation, it didn't really have a high impact. GDP remained very, very low. I also did other things like increasing quantitative easing. This is basically a form of unconventional monetary policy where the central bank effectively prints extra money and uses it to purchase bonds and stocks. Since the situation was so bad, I eventually offered stimulus checks, which in the simulation are called helicopter money. This is basically money that you give directly to the people to allow them to consume, reduce poverty, and stimulate the economy. So this was supposed to have a big impact. I increased it quite a lot, and still GDP remained extremely, extremely low. I took other measures to stimulate the economy in line with what Trump has promised or in line with what Trump has done in the past. So for instance, I offered rural development subsidies, something that Trump seems in favor of. He has spoken about it several times, even though, to be fair, during his presidency, he actually decreased the funding for rural areas in some cases, but that's for another day. And in general, beyond reducing pollution controls or reducing car emission standards and things like this, I also reduced or eliminated all kinds of regulations, because Trump has talked about this a lot. He has talked about deregulating the economy, that is reducing regulations, and he has talked about eliminating the administrative state. So basically, the state having an important role in terms of regulating the economy. So in practice, this means different things. I reduced other regulations such as consumer rights. I reduced competition law to make it very pro-companies. I decreased labor rights pretty much to the minimum. I reduced work safety laws. I canceled all kinds of limits to automated trading. All these are things that Trump did during his presidency, so we can expect him to do something similar again during the second term. For instance, during his presidency, he massively reduced work safety regulations, he reduced the number of workplace inspections, and he trimmed the regulatory powers of several federal agencies. So again, he's spoken a lot about this, about reducing regulation to making companies' lives better, which is supposed to stimulate the economy and make GDP go up. But this didn't quite happen in the simulation. So what happened? Why did GDP remain so low during the whole simulation? I think there are two main reasons for this. The first one was kind of bad luck, because during his presidency, according to the simulation, there was quite a huge global recession. which of course also has an impact on America's economy and the GDP. So that was kind of bad luck. By the end, the global economy was doing better, but still that didn't allow the United States economy, the GDP, to go up. Then there were other important reasons why the GDP didn't go up. First of all, Trump's policies eventually created a huge debt crisis. We will talk about taxes later, but basically, I fit it into the game his promises. I reduced the corporate tax, I slightly reduced the income tax because he has offered to exempt tips and social security benefits from taxes. And at the same time, in line with his promises again, I kept very high military spending. I didn't make any cuts into healthcare or social security as he has promised. I massively increased the funding for the police, money to buy military equipment for the police, and there were also other additional costs related to oil subsidies, rural development, agriculture subsidies, or biofuel subsidies. All things that he has promised to do, but all that has led to a massive deficit, which in turn has led to a debt crisis. A debt crisis, of course, creates huge problems for the economy. It reduces business confidence and it creates high interest rates. There's an element of truth in this simulation. I mean, debt in the US has increased exponentially both during Republican and Democratic administrations, and the Trump presidency was not an exception. So here we can see how the red line, which is the expenditure of the United States, went up by a lot. It almost doubled with all the different subsidies and policies that Trump did. And the income, that is this green line here, it slightly reduced, which basically means that if you have more expenditure and less income, the deficit is way bigger and the debt will grow and grow. Here we can see the blue line, the debt of the United States, how it just continued to go up exponentially, and this made the interest rates to go up, the pink line. So I don't really think there will be a debt crisis under Donald Trump's presidency. I think this simulation, what it shows is that his promises are a bit unrealistic because he has promised to reduce taxes, but at the same time increase the funding for the police, the military, and different things, while at the same time keeping the same level of spending on healthcare, education, and social security. So that doesn't seem realistic. I mean, you need to match the income with the expenditure. If you do that, if you reduce taxes by a lot and at the same time you increase the expenditure, you create a huge deficit that eventually creates problems in terms of business confidence, high interest rates for your debt, and eventually creates a debt crisis. And if you have a debt crisis, the GDP will plummet. So there were several other reasons why GDP remained so low. One of them is the skills shortage. I will speak about education later, but this basically means that there are not enough qualified workers for the level of technology of the economy. So that was a huge problem. It also didn't allow the GDP to go up. Another reasons were a very high oil price. Here we can see how the price of oil remained extremely high, even though we tried to promote the oil supply through oil drilling subsidies, but that didn't help that much. And that's mostly due to the high demand for oil and also the very weak strength of the dollar, which basically means that it's much more expensive to buy oil. And then there were other reasons, such as the high level of crime or also the low level of business confidence, which in turn is also related to the debt crisis and other issues like extreme violence and crime. Beyond GDP, I also introduced other promises made by Trump. One of them is the introduction of high import tariffs. So this is basically taxes that you have to pay when you export goods to the United States. So he has promised a minimum of 10% tariffs, and for Chinese goods specifically 60%. And so I introduced very high tariffs, as you can see. This does have a high impact in terms of reducing unemployment, but of course it has a very bad impact when it comes to international trade for obvious reasons and foreign relations. So of course other countries don't really like it when you make them pay extra money to export their goods to other countries. But patriots really like it. So these tariffs help the unemployment to go down because it basically means that it's more expensive to buy goods produced in other countries. So that will promote the production of goods, the industry in the country, in the United States. So that's why unemployment went down. And here we can see how at the very beginning of the simulation, unemployment went up, basically because of the bad economic situation and the very low GDP. But then, mostly because of the high tariffs, it started to go down, but then it stayed quite stable, which is interesting because it shows that in the end, the main reasons for unemployment are GDP and also the level of industrial automation. So different policies such as state schools, rural development grants, agriculture subsidies, tariffs, military spending, etc. do help to reduce unemployment, but in the end, you need the economy to be doing good, and you also have to deal with the issue of industrial automation. Let's now have a look at the taxes. So first of all, in line with Trump's promises, I reduced the corporation tax. This is a direct tax on the profits of business. So in real life right now, the tax is at 21%, and Trump has promised to reduce it to 20%, but to 15% for businesses that produce goods in the United States. Now, there's not such option of having two different corporate taxes in this simulation. So what I did is to set it at 18% because I think that's a reasonable average. And then what I did is to reduce the income tax because this is something that Trump has promised to. He has promised to exempt tips and social security benefits from these taxes. Again, there's not such a detailed option in the simulation. So what I did was to reduce slightly the income tax. So here we can see how this actually had a big impact in terms of the income of the state. It went down by a lot. And this is due to the combination of decreasing the tax, but also the bad economic situation. If there's a recession, that means that less people are paying taxes and you receive less income. And if on top of that you reduce the tax, then that means that you start to run out of money basically because the income is plummeting. So beyond that, in line with what Trump has done during his presidency and what in general Republicans really liked, I introduced a very high merit tax allowance. This is basically a tax break for married couples, given as an encouragement for people to marry and also to stick together. So basically it means that you have discounts in the taxes that you have to pay if you pay as a married couple. So what this does is to create incentives to be married and remain married. That's why religious people, conservative people, and parents really like it because it basically supports the nuclear family. And it decreases the amount of single parents and single people overall, and also gender tension. The problem, of course, is that it costs money because you are getting less taxes. You are reducing the income of the state. Then I left other taxes without touching. I didn't change the sales tax. I didn't change the inheritance tax because Trump has not spoken about it, neither in terms of increasing it or decreasing it. So all that stayed the same. What I did do is I changed the earned income tax credit. This is a federal tax credit, so a discount in the taxes that you have to pay for working people. This is actually a policy that both Democrats and Republicans have supported a lot over the last couple of decades because it's a tax discount that you get if you work, but you still have a low income. So what it does is that it creates incentives for people to work because if you're unemployed, you don't get it. And also it reduces poverty because it basically means that people who have a low income, they have to pay less taxes. And therefore it reduces unemployment, it reduces poverty, and it improves equality by a bit. Of course, the problem is that this is very expensive because again, you're reducing the amount of income that the state gets. So those were the only changes that I did in terms of taxes. And again, as you can see here, the green line, that meant that the income went down by a bit, which paired with the increasing amount of expenditures meant that there was a growing deficit, and that eventually created a debt crisis. Let's now talk quickly about energy and environment. So first of all, a big problem during the whole game was the oil price, the price of oil. So oil price remained very high, which creates problems for the economy because it leads to higher prices and low growth. Here we can see how it remained extremely high. And so this is mostly due to the strength of the dollar. So basically, due to GDP, the strength of the dollar was very, very low. And this is also due to high inflation, which is related to different measures that we took to try to stimulate the economy, but also the debt crisis itself. So to try to solve this in line with Trump's policies and promises, we tried to increase the supply of oil by giving oil drilling subsidy, in line with Trump's drill baby drill philosophy. That should have increased the supply of oil and reduced prices, but while supply did go up a bit, prices remained quite stable, quite high. So in line with Trump's promises, I have also cancelled all kinds of subsidies for renewable energy. I also canceled all kinds of microgeneration grants. This has of course led to a massive reduction in the amount of wind and solar based power stations. It has reduced basically from 30% to 10%, a massive decrease, it's huge. And this is also due to the fact that we were giving subsidies to oil drilling to try to increase the supply, which in turn led to making renewable energy less attractive and more expensive. So overall, as we can see here, electricity from renewable energy went down from 20% to 5%, which is insane. It's a huge reduction. Now let's have a look at other kinds of energy and what happened with them. So first of all, let's look at electricity from coal. First, it slightly went up, mostly because of canceling subsidies for solar and wind, but then it went down, mostly because of making oil very attractive by offering oil subsidies, but also because of nuclear energy. So Trump really likes nuclear energy. He has made several statements in that direction, and he has promised to expand United States nuclear power as a lever against China and Russia's influence in the global nuclear market. He has promised actually to make electricity cheap with hundreds of new power plants and modular nuclear reactors. So in this simulation, I allowed for the widespread expansion of nuclear reactors. And did this have a huge impact because basically the amount of nuclear power stations tripled in 4 years, which is absolutely insane. This made the amount of electricity from nuclear power stations to go up, and therefore it made the price of electricity went down by quite a lot. Price of electricity went down through the whole game, not by a lot, but quite something, over 10%, and this in turn made poverty and inequality go down. Finally, Trump also really likes hydroelectricity. He wishes the United States would use hydroelectric power more to meet its energy demands. He has made several statements in that direction. So in line with those statements, even though it's not a promise, but due to the energy problems that we had, I thought it would be reasonable to create a hydropower expansion project, not with a lot of funding, low funding, but still, as a way to increment electricity generated this way. So this had an impact obviously in terms of increasing electricity generated through hydropower, but it was a small impact. But still, I think it contributed to fossil fuels energy not skyrocketing, and it also had an impact in terms of the price of electricity to be quite low. So overall, even though we cancelled all forms of support for wind and solar, electricity from fossil fuels did not went up by a lot, mostly because of the widespread expansion of nuclear energy and also, to some degree, hydropower. Electricity supply was healthy and electricity prices went down by quite a lot, which is good news for low-income and middle-income people. And now there's the question of what happened with CO2 emissions and the environment overall, so let's have a look at that. So in the beginning, even though we eliminated all kinds of emission controls, CO2 emissions actually went down. But this was mostly due to the GDP going down. So if the economy is doing worse, there's less production, less consumption, and that obviously makes CO2 emissions to go down. After that, however, CO2 emissions started to go up again, and this was mostly due to car usage and also the very low car fuel efficiency, because there were no kind of emission standards and there were no subsidies for electric vehicles. And this was also due to fossil fuels. So either it's oil, coal, or natural gas they had a big impact in terms of increasing CO2 emissions. Then there were some issues like biofuel subsidies or electric car transition that did help a bit to keep the amount of CO2 emissions in check, but still they went up by quite a lot by then. And in terms of the overall environment, the situation started very bad and remained very, very bad through the whole simulation. This is for similar reasons than the CO2 emissions, the use of cars, and also electricity from fossil fuels. Now, I did keep some funding for waste management and recycling, which made the situation slightly better, but overall the situation with the environment was very bad, very precarious. Now let's speak about transport. In line with Trump's promises and positions, I supported car usage, and I also supported traditional cars, that is, cars with internal combustion engines. So first of all, I didn't offer any subsidies for electrical vehicles, but it was interesting because the electric car transition continued, it went up. But this was mostly due to high oil prices and the high level of technology, which created incentives for people to switch to electric vehicles, even if there were no subsidies for that. So the quite high level of electric car transition did help to keep the CO2 emissions in check. I also offered quite high biofuel subsidies. This is something that Trump supports very strongly. Now, to be honest, Trump doesn't support this because of the environmental side of things. He supports this because the production of biofuels, that is, fuels that are created by agricultural products such as corn, does create extra income for farmers. Now, he supports it at least rhetorically because in the past he introduced some changes that made farmers quite mad, but still he's promised to increase biofuel subsidies, so I stick by his word. In terms of overall car usage, it was very interesting because car usage was already very, very high when we started the simulation, but it went up even more to the maximum. This is mostly due to the high investment in road construction, something that Trump has promised. He really favors road construction and the expansion of highways, so this is something that I increased funding for quite a lot, major expansion, even though it's quite expensive. And so here, as we can see, this increases by a lot car usage and it decreases traffic congestion. But see, this is quite interesting because here we can see how building more roads is supposed to reduce traffic congestion, and indeed it went down, but not by a lot. And this is because while building more roads creates less congestion short term, long term it also makes more people use their cars, and using cars in the end is what creates more traffic congestion. So that's why even though we built a lot of roads, a lot of highways, traffic congestion didn't really improve that much. Finally, here we can see how the efficiency of car fuel went down slowly. Of course, in line with Trump's approach to environmental regulation, I didn't allow any kind of emissions limits or emission standards on cars. That's because during his presidency, Trump rolled back emission standards introduced during the Obama presidency. So in line with this approach, I didn't allow for any regulation for car emission standards. Finally, I didn't offer any kind of subsidies or funding for trains and buses because this is not something that Trump generally supports. I did keep some level of subsidies for school buses, even though I decreased the funding because this is something that I think Trump would do. And that's why bus usage went down, along with the increase in the use of cars. And also because of that, rail usage went down, even though by the end, interestingly, it went up again a bit because of rural development grants. So overall, both bus usage and rail usage remained very low, which is in line with reality in the United States, and nothing changed in this regard. Most people just kept using cars. Overall, under Trump, car was the king. In terms of education, a few interesting things happened. First of all, we had a huge problem with a skills shortage. This is due to the combination of two factors. First of all, technological development went up, and second, the level of education remained rather low. So first, let's have a look at technological development under Trump's presidency. In line with Trump's policies and promises, I kept a reasonable level of funding for technology colleges and technology grants. This is something that we can say that he supported during his presidency, and I think he would keep supporting that. He actually kept a high level of support for intellectual property rights, of course, extremely high military spending. So I kept all that in place, and that led to a high technology development. But the problem is that if there's technological development, but education remains stable or even goes down, then you will not have enough workers with the knowledge and skills needed for the labor market because they do not catch up with that technological development. So, as we can see here, the level of education remained quite stable and low. We did not offer any kind of university grants, and there was no skilled immigration that could fill the skills gap. So that led to a massive problem of skills shortage, which in turn created more problems for the economy. In terms of practical policies, I introduced some cuts in funding to state schools because under his presidency, Trump proposed cuts of 13.5% to state schools, and he has been quite critical of public schools lately, accusing them of being woke. So in line with his past actions and his rhetoric, I reduced funding for state schools. And instead, what we did was to offer funding for religious schools. As we can see here, I didn't provide a lot of funding because I think that wouldn't be the case anyway. And also we had a huge deficit crisis already. So we gave some funding for religious schools, and we also supported overall private schools by offering school pushers and school tax credits. These are basically measures to provide additional funding to families to send their kids to private schools. So for instance, school tax credits is a system of tax reductions and credits designed to encourage people to spend their money on private education in order to reduce their tax liability. And school pushers is something similar, is a measure designed to encourage the growth of private schooling while still enabling everyone to afford an education. School vouchers are issued by the state to parents for each child, which they can then spend in the private sector on education. So basically it's kind of a gift card that you can use for your kids to go to private schools. So I introduced these two policies because Trump has been a big supporter of what he calls school choice. This is basically the idea that families should be able to choose whether they send their kids to public or private schools. And in practice, that means that the state might provide funding to religious schools, and it might provide tax credits and school vouchers to families to send their kids to private schools if they want so. In terms of education, by the way, I also made sure that there were optional prayers in school, since this has been a big topic for Trump. It doesn't really have an impact on education, but of course that makes the religious membership go up and it makes religious people happy. Now, something weird happened. Even though I introduced all these measures to support school choice, as Trump calls it, private schooling did not go up, which, to be honest, I feel like it's a bit unrealistic. I mean, if you reduce funding for public schools and provide subsidies for religious and private schools, I think in real life private schools would become more important, more families would send their kids to private schools. But in any case, that didn't happen in the simulation. I mean, it's true that I did not provide a lot of funding for this because we had a huge deficit already. Finally, in terms of education, I increased funding for adult education subsidies. These subsidies are a way to encourage people to retrain and continue their education after they have joined the workforce. So it's basically vocational training. I didn't know this, but Trump is actually a big fan of vocational training, or at least he says so. So I think it was a reasonable assumption to increase funding for adult education subsidies, given the problems that we had with the skills shortage and functional illiteracy. And it did help a lot, actually. Here we can see how it helped mitigate different problems that we had, and it also improved education, productivity, culture, local communities. But still, vocational training by itself could not totally solve the problems. So overall, the level of education remained quite stable. Some policies helped, like subsidies for adult education centers or vocational training, but some other policies, like the lack of university grants or the reduction of funding for public schools, certainly didn't help. We ended up with a skills shortage, which is not only related to education, but also to the lack of immigration with skills, but also to the fact that there was no skilled immigration and to the fact that technological development went up, so it was not possible to catch up. In short, there were not enough workers with the knowledge and skills needed for that level of technological development. So we're getting closer to the end. Now let's have a look at health, welfare, and other public services. So in line with Trump's policies, I did not make any cuts in state health service in public healthcare because he has promised not to do any cuts in this. Yet I did introduce some policies for people to use private healthcare. So that's why private healthcare, especially by then, went up by quite a lot. And these policies are health tax credits and healthcare vouchers. These policies are very similar to the equivalent that we saw for education. So healthcare vouchers are basically like a gift card that you can use for private healthcare, a measure designed to encourage the growth of the private healthcare while still enabling everyone to access it. And health tax credits are a system of tax reductions and credits designed to encourage people to spend their money on private healthcare in order to reduce their tax liability. So we introduced those policies and we left public healthcare with the same level of funding, but we left these policies as a way to incentivize people to use private healthcare because I think that's aligned with Trump's ideology and Trump's priorities. Overall, the quality of health of Americans remained extremely low. For context, the simulation started around here, so it was already very bad and it just remained extremely bad. And the reason is that while we didn't make any cuts in funding for public healthcare, and while private healthcare went up, there are a lot of social and environmental factors that make the health of people to be very bad. And some of these causes are a very long working week, which in turn is related to the cuts in labor rights and work safety laws that we made in line with Trump's actions. There was a high level of pollution, which of course makes health to be bad. There was a contagious disease according to the simulation. There were problems with drug addiction, obesity, alcohol abuse, a food crisis due to very high prices for food. And so all these issues of course make health go down. The bad state of Americans' health also had to do with the cuts that we introduced in different welfare policies. So in line with Trump's history, we introduced cuts into food stamps. We massively reduced the funding for this, even though we didn't totally cancel it. And we also introduced cuts for free school meals, even though in this case we didn't reduce it by that much. Because as president, he proposed to cut the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, with the idea that he wanted to reduce dependency on government assistance. So I introduced cuts to food stamps and free school meals, but that's a problem because these policies do have a big impact in terms of reducing poverty and the food crisis. Other social and welfare policies also had an impact in this regard, such as the low level of work safety laws, something that I spoke about before, or the low level of social care spending. There was a drug treatment scheme which helped a bit to improve health and decrease drug addiction, but still drug addiction slowly improved also because of the different law and order policies that we implemented, but the problem was not solved. In terms of other welfare policies such as the disability benefit, the state pensions, or spending in social care, I didn't make any changes because Trump has promised not to cut social security benefits, so that remained low but stable. I also left untouched some level of funding for family planning. I did this because Trump does support family planning to some degree. He supports IVF, for instance, in vitro fertilization, something that religious people don't really like, but Trump has supported in his campaign. And finally, I did provide a high amount of funding for child benefits. This is because during his presidency, Trump increased child benefits from $1,000 to $2,000, and recently Vance pitched the idea of boosting child benefits to $5,000. So I reflected that by providing a high amount of funding for child benefits. Child benefits are a fixed payment made by the state directly to parents to assist in the cost of bringing up children. As you can see, it's quite a popular policy, especially among parents for obvious reasons, but the problem is that it's very, very costly. So finally, let's have a look at foreign policy. First of all, we have to talk about foreign relations because they remained very, very low. Other countries did not like the Trump presidency. And this is due to different things such as police brutality, harsh immigration rules, high tariffs, arms exports, the country being perceived as an authoritarian government, the border wall, high CO2 emissions, prison conditions, etc., etc. All these different issues made other countries not have a good relationship with the United States. Now, to be clear, the level of foreign relations before Trump's presidency was already very low in the simulation, but Trump's policies certainly didn't help. And the low level of foreign relations also had an impact on international trade, which remained very low, and also foreign investment, which remained at the minimum. But let's have a look at international trade, because foreign relations are a factor in terms of promoting international trade. But as we can see, the main factor was the high import tariffs, which is not surprising because if you make imports more expensive, then there will be less trade overall. And also other countries will be mad and they will seek less trade with the United States. In any case, the good news is that the level of global influence of the United States went up during Trump's presidency. And this is mostly due to the very high level of funding for the military. As we can see, I kept the level of support for NATO membership and United Nations membership quite low, but I didn't totally cancel it. Now, I did this because even though Trump has talked, for instance, of leaving NATO if other countries don't provide enough funding for their militaries, I don't think he would really do that, and other countries are catching up with funding anyway. And so I kept it low because Trump, for instance, did these threats to NATO countries. He also left the Paris Agreement or the World Health Organization, but overall I don't think he would actually leave the United Nations or NATO, for instance. I already spoke about other policies that have to do with foreign relations, but let's have a quick look. I built a border wall as Trump promised. I didn't provide a high level of funding because the deficit was big, but I did provide funding for that. I introduced very harsh border controls with armed guards at the border. I also kept a high level of arms exports, something that Trump supports overall. We made immigration rules very hard. We made it very difficult to immigrate to the United States. We kept a very low level of funding for foreign aid. We also introduced a total ban on refugees. This is something that Trump has promised during his campaign. And finally, again, we introduced very high tariffs. So all this overall made other countries not be very happy with the United States, and that explains why foreign relations were quite low. But the level of influence of the United States globally improved basically because of the high level of funding for the military. So overall, I think these are the most important points after the simulation of Trump's presidency. Violent crime went down by 30%, which is quite a lot, but proved quite persistent due to the social causes of crime. Normal crime, non-violent crime went down by only 10-15%, which is not a lot taking into account the amount of funding that we provided for the police and other measures. And this is due again to the social causes of crime. Drug cartels decreased by quite a lot but proved resilient. High police funding and tough sentencing increased police brutality and recidivism. It also created a sense of the United States being an authoritarian government, and the sense of safety overall increased significantly. And immigration, both legal and illegal, plummeted. In terms of the economy, the GDP remained persistently low despite various measures. A global recession and massive debt crisis were major factors in this. High tariffs were introduced, affecting foreign investment and relations, and unemployment remained high, even though it improved a bit due to broader economic problems. In terms of taxes, the corporation tax and the income tax were reduced, but that did contribute to a bigger deficit and eventually to the debt crisis. In terms of energy and environment, oil prices remained very high despite increased drilling. Wind and solar energy dropped from 20% to 5%. Nuclear energy expanded significantly, it basically tripled, and CO2 emissions initially decreased due to low GDP, but then increased by quite a lot. In terms of transport, car was the king. Car usage went up even more due to the high investment in road construction. Traffic congestion slightly decreased but remained stable, and public transport, buses and trains remained stable or slightly decreased. In terms of education, we had a huge problem with a skills shortage. So basically, there were not enough workers with the necessary knowledge and skills, taking into account the technological development, which went up. Funding for state schools was cut, and funding for religious schools and private schools increased. We did increase funding for adult education and for vocational training, but the lack of university grants and the lack of skilled immigration did not help to solve the problem of the skills shortage. In terms of health, we kept the same funding for public healthcare, and we introduced several measures to incentivize the use of private healthcare, but overall the quality of health of Americans remained extremely low, and this is due to social and environmental factors like poverty, drug addiction, alcohol, pollution, a food crisis, and more. We reduced funding for food stamps and for free school meals, but we kept the same amount of funding for pensions, disability benefits, and social care because Trump has promised not to cut social security, and we did increase funding for child benefits. Finally, in terms of foreign policy, the level of foreign relations was pretty low, and this was due to different Trump policies, even though they were quite bad from the beginning. The level of international trade was also extremely low, and this was due both because of the low level of foreign relations, but also the high tariffs that Trump introduced. But the United States overall did improve its level of global influence due to the high amount of funding for the military. So I think it's interesting to see what demographic groups are the most happy and the least happy with Trump's presidency and Trump's policies. And here we can see how the group that is the most happy with Trump's policies is actually state employees, but this is basically due to the police force and the military. Since we have extremely high levels of funding for the police and for the military, these policemen and soldiers are extremely happy with Trump. Then farmers are also very happy with Trump's policies, and this is not surprising due to the fact that we provided quite a lot of biofuel subsidies, but especially a high amount of agriculture subsidies and rural development grants. Again, this is all things that Trump has promised during his campaign or that he has done in the past. Then, quite unsurprisingly, religious people are also very happy with his policies because again, he supported school prayers in school. He reduced the secularity of education, so he gave it a more religious tone. He provided funding for religious schools and he reduced the abortion law. And here we can see how also wealthy people were very happy with Trump's presidency, mostly due to the low taxes. Patriot people were also very happy, mostly due to all these foreign policy laws that Trump introduced, like the border wall, the high tariffs, the harsh immigration rules, etc. And also conservatives were very happy, mostly due to the improvement in crime, but also other issues like the marriage tax allowance or the welfare fraud department. And also conservative people were very happy with Trump's presidency, mostly due to the high amount of policemen, the improvement in terms of crime, but also other policies such as the immigration enforcement force or the marriage tax allowance. And finally, some of the groups that were the most annoyed with Trump were environmentalists, trade unionists, liberal people, parents, ethnic minorities, and self-employed people.